The docking bay of Outpost Epsilon smelled faintly of ozone and cold steel, the air sharp with the constant recycling of the polar climate systems. It was here, under the vast transparent canopy that showed the pale sun of Krinva's frozen moon, that Lieutenant Larry Hale stood while the rest of the expedition team assembled. His breath misted in the frigid air, not because the temperature was unmanageable — inside the station it was still regulated — but because the environmental systems near the open shuttle doors never quite kept up with the draft. He adjusted the thick wool scarf wound around his neck, its coarse fibers scratching faintly against his skin, and ran a gloved hand over the fur trim of his hood. The material was heavy, layered, and, to the alien eyes watching him, hopelessly outdated. Several of the alien crew members, tall, elegant beings from the crystalline world of Riss and Compact, scaled traders from Zarok, stood in their sleek thermal suits, their armor-like outer shells gleaming under the hangar lights. Micro-heating units hummed quietly inside their exosuits, feeding warmth evenly through their bodies. Every panel and seam was precision-engineered, carrying the latest technology approved by the Galactic Exploration Council. One of the Rissian officers, Commander Cyril, tilted her translucent head slightly, the gesture a sign of amusement among her kind. "Tell me, Hale," she said with her faintly musical voice, "did you lose your luggage and borrow something from a museum?" A couple of Zaroki crew members chuckled, their sharp teeth flashing. Larry didn't bother answering. He was used to this kind of ribbing. From the moment he had walked into the outfitting room the day before, wearing multiple layers of wool, canvas, and leather instead of the standard-issue heated bodysuit, the comments had started. Primitive was the word most of them preferred. Some said it with humor, others with thinly veiled pity, as if he had been too stubborn or too poor to secure proper gear. He had listened to every remark in silence, remembering his grandmother's voice in his head. "Never argue with a man in fair weather. Let the storm do your talking." Now, as the crew gathered for the final briefing, he scanned the line of faces, some human, most alien, taking in their polished gear, their confident stances. Commander Cyril went over the mission parameters. A 7-day trek across the southern polar flats to reach Survey Station Theta, a remote outpost that had gone silent 3 weeks earlier. The terrain was flat ice broken by occasional ridges, the weather unpredictable but known for sudden whiteouts. Temperatures could swing wildly, but at night, in the open, -80 degrees Celsius was not unusual. The technology in the suits was designed to keep the wearer alive and functioning for the entire journey, provided the power units held. When the meeting ended, the team began moving toward the shuttle. A few of the crew members brushed past Larry, giving his thick boots or bulky coat a pointed glance. One of the Zaroki engineers, Jask, muttered just loud enough for Larry to hear, "You'll be stiff as a frozen board before we're halfway there." Larry only smiled faintly. He had heard worse during his years in the service. Inside the shuttle, as the engines hummed and the craft lifted from the outpost, the cabin's temperature began to drop in preparation for planetary conditions. Most of the aliens adjusted the temperature regulators on their suits without thinking. Larry simply loosened his scarf and unzipped the top layer of his coat slightly, already feeling the familiar slow build of warmth between the layers. Wool was strange that way. It didn't just keep heat in, it breathed, letting just enough out so he didn't sweat and chill himself. It was an old lesson learned in the high passes of his home mountains, where he had followed his grandmother through snow that swallowed rooftops. As the shuttle descended toward the surface, a thin veil of frost formed along the windows. The white expanse of the polar flats stretched endlessly in every direction, a blinding field of frozen light under a pale sky. The moment the landing ramp lowered, a wave of cold air rushed inside, sharper and more alive than the processed chill of the outpost. Larry stepped down onto the ice, his boots gripping firmly with studded soles, his breath steady. Around him, the others activated suit seals and thermal shields, their movements smooth, mechanical. Commander Cyril gave the order to begin the trek. The team moved in a loose formation, the alien suits cutting through the wind with aerodynamic curves. Larry moved at the same steady pace he always had in harsh environments, deliberate, conserving energy, letting his body heat slowly stabilize inside his layers. He could feel the wind pushing against his outer coat, hear the low hiss of it over the fur trim of his hood. The scarf trapped the warmth of his breath before it could escape into the air. Behind him, one of the Rishan scouts whispered to her partner about how ridiculous it looked to wear so much weight when heat-on-demand technology could do the work more efficiently. Larry ignored it, focusing instead on the faint crunch of ice beneath his boots and the shifting brightness of the landscape as thin clouds passed overhead. He knew how this would play out. He had seen it before, not on this world, but on others. Places where technology was built for ideal conditions, not for what actually happened in the field. Out here, on Kryn Va, there was no repair shop, no spare reactor units waiting just over the next ridge. Out here, survival meant trusting in what had already been tested by time and weather, not by laboratory trials. By midday, the temperature had already dropped noticeably, the wind carrying with it a fine spray of ice crystals that stung exposed skin like tiny needles. Larry's face remained mostly shielded by his hood and scarf, but the others were beginning to shift uneasily in their suits, making minor adjustments. It was nothing serious yet, just the subtle signs of discomfort that came before real problems. As they reached a shallow depression in the ice, Commander Cyril called for a brief rest. The group huddled in a loose circle, their shadows stretching long across the snow. Larry sat quietly, pulling a small cloth-wrapped bundle from his pack. Inside was a hard biscuit and a flask of steaming liquid, tea brewed that morning and stored in an insulated thermos. He sipped it slowly, the warmth seeping into him. One of the Zeroki glanced over, puzzled by the lack of mechanical heating elements in his gear. "You're really just wearing all that?" the alien asked, genuine confusion in his voice now. Larry gave a single nod. "Layers," he said simply, "like my grandmother taught me." He didn't explain more. Not yet. He knew the storm would come, and when it did, he wouldn't have to say a word. The rest of the team finished their adjustments and began moving again. The wind was picking up, the temperature dropping further. Larry could feel the shift in the air, the way it seemed heavier, denser. He knew it would be a long, cold night ahead. And he knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had lived through worse, that his so-called primitive clothing would do exactly what it needed to do, keep him alive when all else failed. The second day on the polar flats began with a thin, pale light spreading across the horizon, the kind of cold light that seemed to drain color from everything it touched. Larry woke to the faint creak of ice beneath the layered fabric of his sleeping roll. His body felt warm, cocooned inside the layers he had carefully arranged before sleep. Outside, the wind had dropped during the night, leaving the camp in a deceptive stillness. When he unfastened the flap of his shelter, the cold slapped him in the face, sharp and immediate. Frost crystals danced in the air, suspended so lightly that they seemed unwilling to settle. He pulled his scarf tighter, stepping out to join the others as the crew began preparing for the day's march. Commander Cyril was already standing near the sleds, her crystalline form catching the weak sunlight. She was speaking to Jask, the Zeroki engineer, who was frowning at the display panel on his sled's guidance unit. Larry could see the faint flicker of concern in the way Jask's scaled fingers tapped the controls. Deliberate, slow, as if trying to coax the system into cooperation without showing how worried he was. Larry didn't interrupt. He had learned to let people work through the early signs of trouble on their own. Most didn't appreciate help until they had run out of options. The team set off across the ice again, their boots and sled runners leaving sharp impressions in the hard surface. The air was drier than the day before, and the cold was beginning to bite deeper. Larry could feel it on his cheeks and the tip of his nose, but the rest of him was insulated under the breathable warmth of wool and fur. His movements remained easy and steady, while he noticed subtle shifts in the others. A slower pace from one of the Rishan scouts, a slight hunch in the shoulders of a human technician whose heated suit was likely struggling to keep up with the dropping temperature. Around midday, the first real sign of trouble came. One of the Zeroki surveyors halted abruptly, his claws fumbling with the clasps of his chest panel. A sharp hiss of vapor escaped when the seal broke, and Larry caught a faint metallic tang in the air. Coolant leak. The surveyor muttered something under his breath, frustration lacing every syllable. Jask hurried over to assist, but Larry knew the problem was not mechanical skill. It was time. A leak in this cold, if not patched immediately and perfectly, would lead to rapid system failure. He watched silently as Jask applied a sealant patch, sealing the suit back up. The surveyor moved on, but Larry could see the tightness in his stride, the small stiffness in his movements. The heat loss had already started. By the time the sun had arced low toward the horizon, the wind returned. It came first as a faint, almost gentle push, then built quickly into a steady force that carried biting crystals of ice. The temperature plummeted, the kind of drop that made exposed metal frost over in seconds. Larry pulled his hood further forward, feeling the fur trim catch the drifting snow before it reached his face. His pace remained measured, but he noticed the others increasing theirs slightly, as if moving faster could push them ahead of the cold. It was a dangerous instinct. Moving too fast would sweat a body, and sweat in these conditions could be fatal once it cooled. As the day wore on, the alien suits began to show more strain. Power cells drained faster in the extreme cold, forcing the wearers to divert energy from auxiliary systems to heating. This dimmed the heads-up displays inside their helmets, making navigation less reliable. A human technician named Russ called out that his display had gone black entirely, forcing him to follow visually in the fading light. Larry glanced at the man's shivering frame inside the once sleek suit and kept walking, leading him toward the sled tracks. The camp that night was quieter than before. The crew moved less energetically, speaking in lower voices. Larry sat near the windbreak wall, slowly pulling a strip of wool from his pack to re-wrap around his midsection, doubling insulation where it mattered most, over vital organs. He saw one of the Rishan scouts watching him curiously, her translucent eyes reflecting the faint light of the portable lamp. She didn't speak, but her gaze lingered a moment too long before she turned away. Later, as Larry lay in his shelter, the wind howled against the fabric in sharp bursts, rattling the poles. The cold outside had deepened to the kind of quiet that only came when temperatures were low enough to freeze the air into stillness between gusts. Somewhere in the camp, a soft mechanical alarm beeped and was quickly silenced. Larry closed his eyes, knowing what it meant. Another suit had slipped into a low-heat emergency mode. He pulled the blanket tighter over his legs, the layers beneath already trapping the warmth he had built through the day. In his mind, his grandmother's words came back again, low and steady. The mountain doesn't care what you wear, only whether you keep the heat you have. When the wind eased for a moment, Larry could hear the faint shifting of someone moving through the camp, perhaps checking equipment or trying to get a failing suit to warm again. He stayed still, conserving energy, breathing slowly through the wool that covered his mouth and nose. The storm was still far from its peak, and he knew the real test would come when the cold stopped being a discomfort and started being a threat. He was ready for that. He wasn't so sure about the others. The third day began under a heavy sky, a pale, colorless expanse pressing low over the horizon as if the heavens themselves were weighed down by the cold. The air felt sharper, more brittle, biting at any surface it could reach. Larry emerged from his shelter and immediately sensed a shift in the camp's atmosphere. The usual murmured exchanges as the crew prepared for the march were replaced by a tense, clipped silence. He spotted Jask crouched beside one of the Zeroki surveyors, his hands buried in the panels of the other's suit. Steam, or was it coolant vapor, escaped in short bursts, vanishing instantly into the air. The surveyor's movements were jerky, his scaled fingers trembling as he tried to help. Larry could tell from the stiffness in the alien's posture that the internal temperature in the suit had already dropped dangerously low. Commander Cyril stood nearby, her crystalline form refracting the dim light in muted shades. She didn't call for Larry, but her gaze flicked toward him as he walked past. He took that as silent permission to intervene. Kneeling beside the surveyor, Larry placed a gloved hand on the alien's arm, feeling the faint vibration of failing systems through the thick material. "Power's gone?" he asked. Jask gave a terse nod, his eyes locked on the failing readout. The internal reactor had frozen, and the backup battery had drained in minutes. Larry didn't waste time arguing about repairs. In this cold, minutes meant everything. He pulled a tightly rolled bundle from the side pocket of his pack, a layered set of wool shirts, a thicker tunic, and an outer windproof wrap. "Get him out of this," Larry said firmly, jerking his chin at the suit. Jask hesitated, eyes flicking between the human's bundle and the alien's advanced but useless equipment. "Now," Larry repeated, his tone leaving no room for debate. It took both of them to unseal the suit and pull it free from the surveyor's body. The moment the outer shell cracked open, a wave of icy air rolled out, and the alien's breath came in short, visible gasps. His scaled skin looked almost dull under the frost that clung to it. Larry didn't stop moving. He stripped the thin thermal underlayer from the alien's frame and began pulling the wool garments over him one by one. Each layer trapped a little more of the warmth generated by his own body, sealing it in. "Keep him moving," Larry instructed Jask once the last wrap was tied securely around the alien's torso. "Small steps, steady. He needs to keep his own heat building." The Zeroki nodded, still looking bewildered at the simplicity of the solution. As they got the surveyor back on his feet, Larry adjusted the outer layer, making sure the wind couldn't slip through any gaps. The alien's eyes met his briefly, a flicker of gratitude there despite the obvious discomfort. By midday, the wind had begun to rise again, carrying with it a fine, cutting snow that blurred the horizon. The crew moved slowly now, their formation tighter, as if instinctively drawing closer for protection. Larry kept an eye on the surveyor he had dressed, noting the way his breathing steadied over the hours. The others noticed too. A Rishan scout walked beside Larry for a while, her translucent gaze fixed on his coat. "It works," she said at last, her voice quieter than usual. "The layers." He gave a short nod but didn't answer. The point was not to win an argument, it was to keep them all alive. Later in the afternoon, another failure struck. Russ, the human technician, stumbled in the snow, his movements sluggish. Larry reached him first, gripping his arm and feeling the cold radiating through the once warm suit. "How long?" Larry asked. Russ's lips were pale, his words mumbled. "Display died an hour ago. Thought I could make it to camp." Larry didn't waste time with scolding. He pulled another bundle from his pack. His supply was limited, but he had prepared for this. He worked quickly, stripping the failing suit from Russ and replacing it with the same layering method he had used earlier. The wool clung close to the skin, the outer layers breaking the wind. By the time Russ was moving again, the cold had stopped its deep creep into his core. Larry handed him a strip of dried meat from his own rations. "Chew slow. Warm from the inside, not too fast," he instructed. Russ nodded weakly and obeyed. That night, the camp was different. There was less laughter, less casual conversation. Instead, there were quiet glances in Larry's direction, some respectful, others still skeptical, but no longer dismissive. The two he had helped were sitting upright, moving their hands over the wool as if still puzzled by its effectiveness. Commander Cyril passed by Larry's shelter, pausing briefly. "You're keeping them alive," she said, not quite as a compliment, but not as an accusation either. He simply replied, "I'm keeping us all alive." When the wind rose to a howl later that night, Larry lay in his shelter listening to the fabric strain against the gusts. Somewhere nearby, a suit alarm blipped and then fell silent again. This time, someone else, not him, was moving through the snow to help. He smiled faintly under the folds of his scarf. The lesson was spreading, and it was only a matter of time before more of them began to see the truth. In this kind of cold, survival was not about the newest technology, but about the oldest knowledge. By the fourth day, the sky had turned an ominous shade of gray that seemed to press closer to the ground with every passing hour. The light was flat, without shadow, and the wind carried a low, steady moan as it combed across the polar flats. Larry could feel the change in the air the way a seasoned climber senses a storm before it breaks. The stillness that had followed the early morning was deceptive, and in his gut, he knew that it was the kind of calm that came just before the real danger. The crew moved more slowly than before, each step crunching against the hardened ice. Frost had formed along the seams of several suits, small crystalline ridges that glittered faintly before being whipped away by a stray gust. Larry adjusted the straps of his pack, scanning the horizon for a suitable place to camp. The surface was an endless expanse of white, broken only by shallow dips and the occasional jagged ridge, but he was looking for something specific, a natural windbreak or a spot where the snow had drifted deep enough for him to dig. By mid-afternoon, the wind began to pick up in earnest. It came in rolling bursts at first, then in longer, sustained pushes that rattled gear and forced the crew to lean into it. Snow and ice crystals stung exposed skin and clung stubbornly to fabric and armor alike. Larry caught sight of the Zeroki surveyor he had helped earlier. The alien's movements were slower than they had been in the morning, the wool layers under his outer wrap doing their job, but still losing the battle against the intensifying cold. Larry moved toward him, steadying him with a hand before urging him to keep close to the center of the group. Commander Cyril called for a halt, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "Visibility is dropping," she announced, though it was already obvious. The horizon was fading into a wall of shifting white, and the ground seemed to vanish just a few meters ahead. Larry stepped forward. "We need to shelter now," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. Cyril hesitated, clearly torn between pressing forward and listening to him. Another gust hit, harder this time, almost knocking one of the Rishan scouts off her feet. That decided it. "Find us a place," Cyril said. Larry led the way toward a low ridge he had spotted earlier. It was barely more than a swell in the ice, but on the far side, the snow had collected into a deep, uneven drift. Without a word, he slung his pack to the ground and pulled out a compact snow shovel. He began digging into the drift, creating a trench that cut down to firmer snow beneath. The others watched for a moment before following his example. Within minutes, the trench widened, and Larry began shaping walls to block the wind. He instructed the crew to pack the snow tight, using their own weight to compress it, and then to lay any spare tarps or panels over the top to form a roof. The aliens, unused to such primitive measures, hesitated at first, but quickly saw the sense in it. As the storm closed in, the temperature dropped with terrifying speed. The wind howled overhead, sending flurries of snow into the air like a living thing. Larry worked steadily, his breath misting in short bursts. He could feel the cold beginning to creep into his fingers despite the gloves, but the trench was taking shape, and that was all that mattered. By the time the last tarp was secured and weighted down with blocks of ice, the first of the suits began to fail. A human technician named Russ stumbled into the trench, his hands shaking violently as he clutched at the seals on his suit. Larry was beside him in an instant, peeling away the outer layer and replacing it with thick wool from his dwindling supply. Another suit alarm blared, this time from one of the Rishan scouts. Commander Cyril helped her inside, her crystalline body dim in the low light. Larry moved between them, ensuring each one was wrapped properly, sealing every gap against the cold. The trench filled quickly with bodies, the crew huddling close in the cramped space. Steam from their collective breaths fogged the air, and for the first time since the storm began, there was a faint sense of warmth. Larry moved along the line, checking on each person, pressing a gloved hand against shoulders and arms to gauge their condition. He handed out strips of fabric for those whose layers were thin, and he instructed them to keep moving their fingers and toes even while sitting still. Outside, the storm raged without mercy. The wind roared like an endless tide, and the sound of ice crystals striking the tarps above was constant, like a drumbeat. Inside the trench, the crew was quiet, each one lost in thought or exhaustion. The Cherokee surveyor met Larry's eyes and gave the smallest of nods. Russ, swaddled in wool and breathing more easily, managed a faint smile. Even Commander Cyril, seated at the far end, regarded Larry with a new kind of respect, silent but unmistakable. Hours passed in the dim shelter. Larry remained alert, rising every so often to adjust the tarps or pack snow against the walls where the wind had begun to eat into them. His muscles ached, and his eyes burned from the dry cold, but he didn't stop. Every life in that trench depended on the shelter holding until the storm passed. When at last the wind began to ease, it was not a sudden change, but a slow, reluctant one. The roar softened to a constant hum, and the light filtering through the tarps grew less dim. Larry rose and pushed back one edge of the covering. Beyond the trench, the world was transformed. Smooth, unbroken snow stretched in all directions, the storm having erased every track and marker. The air was still bitterly cold, but without the wind, it was bearable. One by one, the crew emerged from the trench, their movements stiff but alive. The wool-clad survivors looked around with something like disbelief, as if realizing for the first time that they had made it through something that could have easily claimed them. Larry didn't speak. He simply shouldered his pack again, adjusted his scarf, and began walking toward the distant horizon. This time, no one laughed at the way he dressed. In the hush that followed the storm, the only sound was the crunch of boots in snow as the entire team fell in behind him. The morning after the storm broke cold and bright, the kind of brittle clarity that made every shadow sharp and every sound travel for miles. Larry rose before the others, stepping out of the trench they had built to survey the endless sheet of white that stretched to the horizon. The landscape was different now, stripped clean by the storm, every previous track and landmark erased. The world looked untouched, as if no living thing had crossed it in centuries. His breath hung in the air for a long moment before dissolving. He knew that reaching Survey Station Theta today would not just be a matter of distance, it would be a matter of endurance. One by one, the crew emerged from the trench. Movements were slow, careful, but they were alive. The wool-clad survivors shifted in their makeshift garments, adjusting scarves and wraps Larry had provided. Those who still had functioning suits kept them sealed, but he noticed a few had added extra fabric beneath their layers. The mockery from days past was gone, replaced by an unspoken acceptance. No one commented on the way Larry dressed, and more than one set of eyes lingered on him with quiet gratitude. Commander Cyril called the group together. Her voice, though steady, lacked its earlier edge of superiority. "We move now," she said. "Station Theta should be within 12 kilometers." Larry nodded once, adjusting the straps on his pack. He took his place near the front, not because it was his duty, but because no one else stepped forward quickly enough. The snow was packed hard by the storm's force, allowing them to make faster progress, though the bitter air gnawed at every exposed edge of skin. By midday, faint shapes began to appear against the horizon, angular structures half buried under drifts, their solar arrays iced over, antennas bowed under frozen weight. As they drew closer, Larry could see the outer walls of Station Theta standing silent, the heavy blast doors shut tight. No smoke rose from the vents, no movement stirred inside the perimeter. The station looked less like an operational outpost and more like a monument abandoned to the ice. Commander Cyril stepped forward to the access panel beside the doors. Her crystalline fingers moved over the controls, but the screen flickered and went dead almost immediately. "Power's gone," she said, glancing back. "We need manual entry." Larry dropped his pack and approached the heavy wheel lock mechanism. The metal was rimed with frost, biting into his gloves as he gripped it. He braced his boots and turned, feeling the resistance of frozen gears, until the lock finally gave with a shuddering groan. The doors slid open enough for them to slip inside. The air inside the station was still, heavy with the metallic tang of frost and old machinery. Frost coated the walls, and every surface felt like a block of ice to the touch. Larry moved ahead, checking rooms as he went, until he found the central control area. The power indicators confirmed what Cyril had suspected. The reactor had shut down days ago, its fuel lines frozen solid. Without heat, the crew that had been stationed here could not have lasted long. They found them in one of the bunk rooms, 3 bodies, covered neatly with blankets. Whoever had been last alive had shown them dignity in the end. Larry stood in the doorway for a moment, his jaw set, before turning away. Survival wasn't always a victory. Sometimes it was just an extension of the inevitable. But for this team, at least, there was still a way forward. The rest of the day was spent working. Larry cleared the vents, broke the ice from the solar panels, and rigged a temporary heat source using emergency chemical packs and the station's ventilation system. The crew worked alongside him, following his instructions without question. Russ moved slowly but steadily, carrying supplies, while the Zeroki surveyor he had saved hauled in panels to reinforce the door against the wind. Even Commander Cyril joined in the manual labor, her crystalline hands coated with frost by the end. By nightfall, the station's main room was warm enough to sit without shivering. The crew gathered in a loose circle, some sipping rehydrated rations, others just resting in silence. The hum of the ventilation system filled the air, and for the first time in days, the wind outside sounded far away. Larry sat near the back, unwinding his scarf and letting the heat soak into his skin. He felt the exhaustion in every muscle, but there was also a quiet satisfaction. Commander Cyril crossed the room and stopped in front of him. For a moment she said nothing, her translucent eyes searching his face. Then she lowered herself to one knee so that she was level with him. "Without you," she said softly, "this mission would have ended in the snow. Your primitive clothing saved us all. I will not forget that." Larry gave a faint smile. "It's not the clothing," he said. "It's knowing how to use it." She inclined her head, then stepped back, returning to her place near the others. The room settled into a tired but comfortable quiet. Larry leaned against the wall, letting his gaze drift to the frost-speckled window. Outside, the moon's pale light stretched across the frozen flats, untouched and unending. He thought of his grandmother then, her hands rough from years of work, her voice steady as she taught him how to layer wool against the cold. She had never seen Kryn Va, never imagined her lessons would carry a crew of alien explorers through a storm on a distant moon. But he knew she would have understood. In the warmth of the reclaimed station, with the cold held at bay for now, Larry closed his eyes. Tomorrow there would be repairs to make, communications to restore, a return trip to plan. But tonight, for the first time in days, he allowed himself to rest, knowing that his team, no longer strangers, no longer doubters, would see the dawn together. The storm had passed, but its lesson remained, etched into each of them as clearly as the frost on the windows. Primitive or not, some knowledge endured because it worked, and in the end, that was all that mattered.